The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, the grassroots labor movement for Medicare-for-All. Plus, is it time to talk about a maximum wage? And Bill Press on the power of the billionaire class. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care believes that health care is a fundamental human right. National Coordinator Mark Dudzic says it's up to unions to take the lead and fix our broken health care system. And we say hello to Mark Dudzic, a national coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care. Mark Dudzic, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, it's great to be here.
Now, it may come as a surprise that there are some members in the labor movement that oppose a single-payer health care system, such as Medicare-for-All. What's the history here?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that have happened. The first is that because of sort of a unique failure in the 1940s to continue the New Deal, the American labor movement took to negotiating healthcare benefits and linking healthcare to employment, and was fairly successful in that for a number of years. And it was a real source of pride for unions if they were able to provide decent healthcare benefits for their members. And they talked about it as a real union advantage, and a sort of a culture grew up that celebrated and supported that kind of work within the labor movement. Now, that started to fray about a quarter century ago, to be honest, as the costs of healthcare became more and more unsustainable, and as employers started going head on after that. So what became a union advantage often now had become a real struggle and a difficult component of union bargaining, so that healthcare for the last couple of decades has been the biggest cause of strikes and lockouts and concession bargaining. So that has kind of moved. But the other dynamic I think that's happened is that often the labor movement, because it's a multi-issue organization, really doesn't want to get too far off message from the Democratic establishment. And so, when we had the Democratic presidential candidate in the last cycle telling people that we would never, ever have single payer, a lot of unions listened to that and felt that they should not really be seen as criticizing the candidate that they endorsed. So I think the dynamic has changed since that moment. Almost every candidate who is conceivably running for president has said that they support some kind of a version of Medicare for all, and that's opened up great new opportunities within the labor movement.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about private insurance. How is the private insurance industry, how is it failing American workers?
Well, let me count the ways. I mean, the private insurance industry, they have a flawed business model to begin with. They make money by denying people care. And, when you have that kind of situation that treats healthcare as a profit center rather than as a public good, you have all the kind of distortions that kind of profit-taking produces. So, we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world by almost 100% more than the average for advanced industrial country. And we, studies have shown that like a working class family of four that has decent employment coverage, that the total costs for that family exceed $28,000 per year. And employers pick up an average of $15,000 and the worker and their families kick in the other 13 or 14,000, and you can just see that becomes unsustainable. The amount that workers have paid for health care, the percentage that they've paid as opposed to the employer, has gone up every year since they started keeping track of this in 1984. So the private insurance industry is just shoveling more and more pain and liability onto the backs of most working families.
Mm-hmm. Now, unions, Mark, are often in the position of bargaining for better health care for their members, of course. What's the impact of that on a sense of solidarity with unions?
Yeah, well, that's really the point of contact that a lot of people have with the issue of healthcare justice is, when they're in that bargaining cycle and they're facing the demands that almost every employer brings to the table nowadays to cut benefits and narrow networks and increase co-pays and deductibles and co-insurance. That's an opportunity to both engage with our members on this and to engage with the wider working class movements that are struggling for healthcare justice. So, the smart unions will frame those fights as fights for healthcare for all and use it both to educate their members on the ground and also to reach out into the community and say that we're fighting not only for the healthcare benefits that we fought so long to win, but we're fighting to expand healthcare to everybody, regardless of their employment status and their union membership.
We're speaking with Mark Dudzic. He's National Coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care. Mark, let's talk more about your organization, the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care, and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, so we launched this project in January of 2009, which was right before the first inauguration of President Obama. It was a very different time, a very hopeful time in a lot of ways. And we launched it because we knew that the political debate was going to be wide open around where to go on healthcare policy, what the future of healthcare was. And we wanted to sort of weigh in, make sure that there was a voice that demanded that single payer be put on the table in those debates and discussions. And so we started with a small group of national unions and a couple of dozen local and regional union organizations around the country who were really committed to pushing this and pushing the labor movement to take the lead in this fight. And, over the years, we've been able to build this out. There's now 14 national unions who are affiliated with our project, a couple hundred regional unions, local unions around the country, including some statewide labor federations. And, the AFL-CIO has taken positions in support of the goal of single-payer Medicare-for-All at the last two conventions. So we've really become a real powerful pole within the labor movement that says that we have to organize and commit resources and political muscle to this fight for healthcare justice.
And, if the labor movement fully backed single-payer healthcare, what kind of difference could that make in the debate?
That would be a game changer. If the labor movement put the kind of resources into this fight that they can still put in, even in our weakened state, that they can still put in into existential fights, we would be, much further along on this fight if they, made this one of their top 2 or 3 issues for lobbying, if they educated and mobilized their members, as some unions are doing today, if they use their political relationships locally and nationally, we could really begin to move this much more aggressively in the body politic.
It seems like it would be, obviously it's, numbers, big numbers. The more people you have, the more success you have. So is there a sense of, perhaps from your organization, of creating sort of a snowball effect and getting more and more of labor movement to fully back the single-payer healthcare?
Yeah, I think we're right at that moment. We see it, it's entering the general political dialogue. Union members now, hear and discuss and think about these things much more than they did 10 years ago when we launched this this project. So, in many ways, we've won the battle of ideas. So now it's really the question of, implementing a real effective strategy that mobilizes us at the grassroots and can move this campaign forward. So we've really, we're really at a crucial moment, and not just within labor. This sort of reflects a much broader social movement that's emerged that sees Medicare-for-All as sort of the wedge issue of a broader transformational politics that people are beginning to embrace. It's a real funny time politically right now. We have these huge challenges with this out of control Trump administration that's trying to push us back into the 19th century. But on the other hand, on the ground, we have all of this ferment of people, working towards a much better world, and a world that treats things like healthcare as a public good and not a commodity. And I'm actually very hopeful that we can move forward in these times.
Well, and you're working with a lot of organizations. Who are some of your allies in this fight?
Okay, well, within the labor movement, I have to say that organizations, unions that represent nurses are the leading lights in our movement. Nurses really get this issue. They're passionate about the desire to create a system that serves the needs of their patients, and they see all of the flaws in the current system. So the National Nurses United, which is the largest national nurses union, is head and shoulders above any other labor organization in this fight, and a number of other nurses unions, like the New York State Nurses Association, and the AFT nurses in Vermont. A number of other nurses unions are really active in this fight. So that's really, and they help transform labor with us. And then there's other organizations on the ground. Healthcare Now is an organization that's been doing community-based organizing and agitating for a number of years, and we really consider them to be our sister organization. Some of the newer progressive organizations have been really consistent on taking this issue up. The Progressive Democrats of America have been with us from the date that they were launched, as has Our Revolution, and some of the longer-term social movement organizations like People's Action and Campaign for Popular Democracy and Public Citizen have also begun to move this into the center of their political and organizing agendas. So we're building some real momentum and building a broad coalition of social movement and labor organizations.
Well, let's keep that snowball growing. That's all I've got to say. Mark Dudzic, National Coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Healthcare, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Mark, thank you so much for your time with us, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon. Great.
Love to be back.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why a labor union president is calling for a maximum wage. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
From kitchen tables worldwide, you can hear a chorus of parents chastising their children with the same refrain. Stop playing with your food. Children aside, this rebuke needs to be loudly directed at the profiteers of industrial agriculture. They keep toying with the very nature of food, not to benefit consumers, family farmers, workers, or the environment, but to fatten the profits of Silicon Valley tech giants, food monopolists, and Wall Street financiers. Meet Recombinetics, Inc. It's a high-tech gene manipulation corporation with bioengineers in its labs remaking farm animals. Pigs, for example. Recombinetics wants to mess with the very DNA of Mother Nature's oinkers to make them produce bigger litters to supply the pork factories of brand-name marketers. It's also genetically altering milk cows to withstand hotter weather, so climate change won't reduce the output of huge dairy corporations. Of course, this corporate government collusion to build Franken animals faces a high hurdle in the marketplace, for consumers have shown again and again that they don't want the food they put on their family tables tampered with. The tamperers, however, have a solution to that problem: secrecy. The industry is lobbying to outlaw any requirement that milk and meat produced by genetically altered animals be labeled as such. Better to keep consumers in the dark because, well, if given a free choice, people might reject Recombinetics in favor of natural food. This is Jim Hightower saying the industrializers are not out to make food better or more affordable for us, but strictly to make it more profitable for them. Rather than remaking animals and the marketplace to benefit corporations that play with our food, let's remake the corporate system so that it cooperates with nature and serves the common good.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. By the most recent estimate, the average CEO in the United States earns an average of 271 times that of a typical worker. Our next guest says it's time to change that with an idea that's rooted in American history. And we say hello to Larry Hanley, International President of the Amalgamated Transit Union. Larry Hanley, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start off by having you explain to us the idea of a maximum wage.
Sure. Well, it's something that is much more, at one point in our society, was much more accepted than it is now. For example, I remember when I was a child, Jim, watching Johnny Carson, and you'd have a parade of celebrities that would come on and complain that they had hit the 90% tax bracket. And in fact, as recently as the 60s, there was a tax bracket high or higher than 90%. And essentially it was there to mediate between the rich and the poor to make sure that people who made wildly high incomes had to contribute back to the Commonwealth and contribute significantly. And there was significant tax reform then, starting with Jack Kennedy and then going all the way through Ronald Reagan, that really cut down on the high-end taxes for wealthy people. And what it's done is it has essentially put the tax burden on the poor and the working class in this country. And the idea behind a maximum income is to say that after anyone makes a certain amount of money, the amount to be discussed, that they can't make any more. and that they should be, in order to make this happen, they should be taxed at 100%. It's been done before. It was done during World War II when Franklin Roosevelt taxed munitions makers at 100% of anything they made over $25,000 a year. And, of course, it was a different economy. There was a lot more money then, $25,000. But by doing that, he said he was protecting the American boys who he was sending over and paying $60 a month to lose their lives from being exploited by a separate part of our society that stayed home and was making piles of money building guns and bombs and bullets to send with them. And there was a big kerfuffle in Congress. Eventually it was reversed. But it is a perfectly reasonable answer to the current problem.
Well, and especially we're talking about a disparity that is, sometimes 700-800 times, somebody's making 800 times more than the average employee at a place and that kind of thing. So you're not talking about asking the leader of a corporation to go to the poorhouse on this, right? I mean, we're still talking about huge amounts of money that they'll still be making even with a maximum wage in place.
Well, sure. They could make tens of millions of dollars. And really, there's no limit to what they could make so long as they paid the people at the low end of their corporation the same amount of money. Mm-hmm. So, or some other multiple of that. So, for example, we talked about having no CEO earn more than 100 times what the guy at the bottom earns. Now, in that situation, if the guy at the bottom earned $25,000 a year, the guy at the top could earn $2.5 million a year. Now, my first premise is there is not a human being on earth who is worth more than $2.5 million a year. There just isn't. It is ridiculous to say, I have such a stressful job that I deserve all this work. There are people working in stressful coal mines who don't get, even fair wages, never mind ridiculously obscene wages. Mm-hmm. So, to start with, relational wages between the lowest income person at the corporation and the highest income person would be one way to start it. And this has actually been taken up by some state legislatures recently. In 5 states, following the lead in Portland, Oregon, there is legislation that's been introduced to establish a ratio beyond which the corporation gets taxed at a much higher rate. So surcharges are being added to corporations who overpay their CEO. You
proposed this idea some 8 years ago. What was the reaction to the proposal?
Well, you know what? That was not a time when people were prepared to hear about maximum wages, although it was closer to the moment we're in, because this was following the crash. And I actually thought it would get a bigger reception on account of that. But, America has bought into the idea that the only true capitalism is unfettered capitalism, which is ridiculous. There is no game that you could play with no rules. You couldn't have boxing tournaments without rules. But America, essentially, when we go to work, we have a boxing tournament with no rules. And the guy at the bottom has continued to get kicked in the face for the last 40 years on account of that. So somebody has to step in and be an adult and establish some adult rules so that the whole society can move together and improve its lot. If not, we're going to live behind, engaged communities in an increasing way.
We're speaking with Larry Hanley, International President of the Amalgamated Transit Union. We're talking on the topic of maximum wage, is something that's been around and really is probably more needed now than maybe we've ever seen in our history. That's up for debate. Has the idea, I guess you touched on this a little bit, Larry, how much support have you seen gained on this idea?
Well, I've had a lot of people compliment the idea, but it hasn't gotten traction in Congress where it needs to happen. I'm hoping that with the more recent batch of members of Congress that have been elected, that this is precisely what they'll take up. And I think they will. I think we've already heard noises from a few of them that they're interested in this type of legislation. And the truth of the matter is that if the majority of people start to focus on this and understand what it means and the value of it for the greater good, that this will be a popular idea. It's just a question of, can we get it out in front of people enough that they really understand it? And I also want to say that one of the unexamined facts here is that major corporations have found this as a way to dip into the federal and state treasuries because, at the same time they're paying their CEOs tens of millions of dollars in salaries, they are paying their employees so low a wage that their employees qualify for federal and state assistance. So essentially, undeniably, our government is directly subsidizing employers who then suck all the money up to the top. So that, if the head of Walmart, CEO of Walmart makes $17 million, 17 million of those are coming from the federal government in the form of food stamps that go to his workers.
You wrote a piece in the Huffington Post and you mentioned Walmart and it really just gave me pause that here you have workers that are trying to figure out how can I live in my car to make ends meet. That's not right.
Yep. That was the state of affairs then, and I guarantee you it's the state of affairs now. Because even though the economy is heated up, we have places, for example, if you went out to California, to San Jose, you will find some of the highest paid bus drivers in the country, but they're living below the poverty line for that city because the elites have driven the cost of living up so high that, I'm not kidding you, no bus driver can live in the city in which they drive a bus. They can't afford it. And that's just, we can't have that kind of exclusionary society. That is not America. That is what I was told was the Soviet Union when I was a kid. There were favorite party members and everybody else was a peasant. America is getting into peasantry. We're well into it, 40 years into having mansions and peasants.
What's next in the campaign to make it actually happen?
Well, I can tell you that the labor movement has many different ways in which we're fighting this. Most of them have been trying to raise the floor, not lower the ceiling. But you'll see us out there involved in legislative efforts. I'm going to particularly focus on Congress this term because I think with the newly elected members, some of them have made it clear that they understand it. And the first point in winning this battle is to understand it. I think we have a lot of members of Congress, perhaps they're willfully stupid, but they've certainly acted stupid over the course of the last 40 years while Americans' jobs were being sent overseas, and at the same time, Americans' existing jobs were being degraded. I think we're about to see a change in that. And I have a lot of faith in our next generation of legislators.
Well, we can only hope so. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that it could get much worse, but I guess it can because it's been incrementally getting worse now for some 40 years.
That's right. But there is hope.
And we appreciate your work that you're doing, and we wish you the best of luck and hope it continues. And I hope we start to see some legislation that brings on this maximum wage. Larry Hanley, International President of the Amalgamated Transit Union, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Larry, we appreciate your time and look forward to hearing back from you soon.
Thank you, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Living in the Billionaire Age, Bill Press talks with Pat Garafalo on his new book, Billionaire Boondoggle.
That story, there's comments there, Peter, about the high-tech companies and the billionaires and the new billionaires who are about to be created as Uber and Lyft and others go public, gets us right to our next topic here, and a exciting new book that comes out just today, launched today, called The Billionaire Boondoggle. Love the title, Billionaire Boondoggle. How politicians let corporations and bigwigs steal our money and jobs. Pat Garafalo from the Center for American Progress, author, in studio with us. Hi, Pat. It's good to see you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
And congratulations.
Thanks.
So this is, we have a billionaire president, right? A billionaire cabinet, and an economy that doesn't do much for the middle class, but is really good for billionaires and millionaires, right?
Absolutely.
We live in the billionaire era.
Yeah, we have been told a story for decades that the way to create jobs in America and to build a sustainable economy is to throw as much money at big corporations and rich people as possible, and eventually they are going to be really nice with all that money and spend it on creating some jobs and, expanding factories and doing whatever it is rich people do, and that's going to benefit the rest of us.
How long has that myth been around, right? I mean, did it start with Ronald Reagan and the trickle down?
You could actually say it started with America itself. The very first corporate tax break in American history was given to Alexander Hamilton in 1791.
Hamilton. And here we're celebrating him on stage.
Yep, he was given a, I believe, 10-year property tax break to build a manufacturing park in Paterson, New Jersey. And within 5 years, they were doing no manufacturing at all there. So this is a myth that goes back to the very beginning of the country.
Right. How many? You talk about tax breaks. I mean, we know what we don't know, whether Donald Trump paid his fair share of taxes. Everybody suspects he did not, which is why he won't release his tax returns. But across the board, I mean, they're either they're corporations or they themselves are big tax cheats, aren't they? Just as a class.
There's that, but also stuff that's totally and completely legal that
right.
we're just doing for awful policy reasons.
Right. I guess that's a better way of putting it. The law really does favor them.
Absolutely. For my book, specifically, I looked at what states and cities give to big corporations, not even the federal level.
Yeah,
and it's tens of billions of dollars a year. Some people say it's 40 billion. You see estimates up to 90 billion. And part of the reason that
where are they coming in what form?
So this is grants given to companies to move places. This is property tax breaks. The biggest recent example is Amazon for their second headquarters, where New York was going to give them some $3 billion. Virginia here, right across the river, is going to give them some $1 billion in tax breaks to build a new headquarters there. And this stuff goes on all over, all the time. The unique thing about the Amazon example is that we heard about it. But usually these deals go on under the radar, totally under the table. No one ever hears about them until it's too late.
Don't we do the same for sports team? I mean, we do.
Absolutely. Yeah, we pay to build sports stadiums for billionaire sports owners all the time. One of the reasons I got into the book...
For billionaire sports owners to make even more money.
Yeah, one of the reasons I got into the book was because back during the Great Recession, I was covering the economic policy beat. The world was falling apart around our ears. The financial crisis had just happened. And I saw Detroit was, at the same time it was threatening to cut public worker pensions, was building a hockey arena for the owner of the Detroit Red Wings, who is a legit billionaire. That seems kind of strange. That's an odd set of priorities for a city that's literally going into bankruptcy to have. And that happens all over, all the time, and not just in the sports arena. We give money to big corporations to just do their thing.
And so a billionaire class is hurting so much that Republicans had to pass a giant tax cut for them in December 2017. How'd that work out? First of all, who benefited from that tax cut?
Exactly who you'd expect. I mean, it worked out exactly in the way that folks like me and folks on the left side of the economic analysis chart said. The corporations pocketed the money. They bought back lots of shares to enrich their executive class. They didn't spend that much money to create jobs or to open new facilities. And that makes sense, right? If you think about why a company is going to create jobs, it's going to create jobs when it senses that it's going to have more customers. If you only sold 15 widgets this year and you only think you're going to sell 15 widgets next year, you're not going to hire anybody else. You're not going to open a new factory. If you think you're going to sell 15 widgets this year and 35 widgets next year, okay, yeah, maybe then we do something. That has nothing to do with the tax rate you're paying or the cash grants you get or your property tax rate. It's based on demand. If there's going to be more customers, you're going to do more stuff. And if there isn't, you're not.
Right. And isn't it true also that I was reading one article yesterday about the fact that the economy has grown, like Donald Trump promised, 5% or something like that. It's been
12, 14, who knows? It changes every day.
But that it's growing so little. One of the reasons that I think this was Larry Summers, actually former Treasury Secretary, one of his comments. Well, one of the reasons it hasn't grown fast enough is that so much from the tax cut and the benefits have gone to the very wealthiest people in the country, who spend less of their income than average middle-class Americans do. When they get a raise or they get a little extra money, they go out and buy something.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean,
these people, the billionaires, they don't need anything.
Yeah, they sock it away. It winds up in a tax haven. It goes into to an unnamed bank account in the Cayman Islands. And that makes sense. If you want to stimulate spending, we had the same exact debate post-financial crisis, during the Great Recession, about the stimulus bill, right? What's the most effective way to stimulate the economy? Give money to people who actually need it and who are going to go and spend it right away and not just stick it in a bank account or stick it in a tax haven.
Right.
Maybe they'll deign to buy a yacht somewhere along the way. It's the same exact debate. Giving money to rich people as a percentage of their spending doesn't really do anything.
Or give to people who are going to use that money to create jobs.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So when you look at we haven't had a chance to, at least most of us haven't, to really examine it in detail. But look at what you know of the president's budget yesterday. It's more of the same, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's, doubling down on the tax bill and then cutting the stuff that is actually going to help people get by in their lives and spend money. I mean, it's this same philosophy that I've been talking about, right? If we just rain money down on high onto rich folks, eventually it will trickle down to the rest of us. It's the same thing we've seen over and over and over from conservatives.
Right. Again, the book is just out today, so strike while the iron is hot here. Anywhere you buy books, your local independent bookstore, hopefully, or online. The Billionaire Boondoggle, St. Martin's Press, great people. My publisher as well, Tom Dunn at St. Martin's Press, editor Stephen Power. The Billionaire Boondoggle: How Our Politicians Let Corporations and Bigwigs Steal Our Money and Jobs. Now, there are some people who are talking about doing something about this, not just you with your book, right? But in a big way, Elizabeth Warren has been out there saying that some of these, like we said, there are banks that are too big to fail. There are some big tech companies that are too big to fail. Is she right on?
I think so, yeah. And actually, one of the interesting things just on the tax break front is that while Amazon was doing its whole song and dance and turning HQ2 into a giant circus and making mayors across America, ask how high when Amazon said jump, Google was going around the country really quietly using shell companies and hoovering up about $1 billion in tax breaks to build facilities. There was a piece in the Washington Post, I want to say a week and a half ago, about this exact thing. And that's what I'm talking about when Amazon in a way was so unique. Because we heard about it and we knew what was going on, and because they decided to turn it into this circus, people were actually able to organize and fight back. And I was actually really encouraged to see that New York said enough. Activists, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, local lawmakers were all like, no, we're not doing this. We're not giving a ton of money to arguably the richest company on earth to come and create a few thousand jobs in our city. Warren talking about breaking up big tech is something different, but I think it's really intriguing. These companies have obviously become super powerful in the way that they can manipulate markets, in the way that they can both host the marketplace if you're an Amazon and participate in it, so then they can use the data of their competitors against them. So talking about breaking those things up and turning those into separate entities, I think is a really important discussion.
Right. Does the government have the power to do that? Or the authority or the...
I think so. We have antitrust laws, right? Monopoly is, in theory, illegal. So you aren't supposed to be able to dominate. I think it's more a sense of will rather than legality. It's having the will to take on these giant companies that in many ways are like looked at as the darlings of the American economy, right? When people want to talk about, oh, great American success stories, who do they point to? Amazon, Facebook, Google.
Well, less so now, maybe, since all the privacy issues have come out.
Absolutely.
But
that's been really, I mean, that's been a really fast turnaround.
It has.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really just been in the last 2 or 3 years that...
Maybe less.
Maybe less.
Yeah,
but
right.
a lot of Americans have said, wow, Facebook is actually bad. You know?
I mean, Facebook manages to like keep stepping on the rake over and over and over.
Yeah.
Every time they say they fix their privacy problem, a new story comes out inevitably 2 days later.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like they time their statements perfectly to come out right before the next privacy violation.
Right.
They're almost trying.
What I found interesting with Elizabeth Warren is that while somebody could say socialist Elizabeth Warren, right? She wants to break up these big corporations. That she painted it as actually a capitalist fix, meaning the result will be more competition and more opportunities for other entrepreneurs and smaller firms to compete in that marketplace. So it's almost like saving capitalism, not denying it.
And there's a long American tradition of not abiding by monopolies, right? We broke up oil companies. We took on Microsoft and said, no, you can't be this giant monopoly in, the not too distant past. So I think there is actually a long American tradition of saying, no, you're not allowed to monopolize a marketplace like this. You're not allowed to dominate the entire economy. And what she says makes sense. The number of stories you hear about these big tech companies coming in and buying a competitor just to suffocate them and never let them see the light of day again, that happens over and over and over again. You can see why the small guys either can't compete or don't even bother to compete because they know, if we even start to get off the ground, Facebook is going to come in with an offer we can't refuse and then just, put us on the shelf.
By the way, do you know it was $3 billion in New York, right, for HQ2 for Amazon, right? Yeah. Or half of HQ2. Mm-hmm. Do you know how much Virginia gave away?
So it's about $750 million from the state, and then it's going to be about another $23 million in incentives from the county. And then there's a story last week that there's going to be another several $1 million in kind of tech industry-related tax breaks. So you're getting close to $800 million. It's always so hard to put an exact number on these things because you don't know what the company is going to claim in the long run, and they're always going to try and claim more than they're due. But I would put it at between $800 million and possibly up to $1 billion.
Right. I remember early in his administration that President Obama said that income inequality was like the number one issue of our time. It's just gotten worse, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I'm not blaming him, but it didn't get any better under him, and it certainly has not gotten better under Donald Trump.
No, and Donald Trump encourages these bad corporate tax deals. Think of Carrier. Think of Foxconn. These are great examples of states coming in and showering money on a company, and Donald Trump comes in and rah-rahs and cheerleads and says, yeah, this is great. We have states competing against each other for business. It's going to be awesome. And then what happens? The company turns around 6 months, a year later, and says, oh, no, never mind. We're not going to create those jobs. We're not going to open that factory in Wisconsin. We were just kidding. Like, forget it. And that happens all over. Those are big, high profile, like Amazon, because Trump inserted his nose into the Carrier and Foxconn deals. We heard about them. But that happens all the time, all over the country, every day. Corporations make promises and then break them and still get rewarded. There was a study that came out of New Jersey a few weeks ago that the state's corporate tax incentive programs had just been chugging along for years, dumping money on all the companies that came into the state. And nobody was tracking the jobs that were created or whether the companies were actually creating the positions they promised. There were 3,000 jobs in New Jersey that just couldn't be accounted for. They showed up on one piece of paper and didn't show up on another piece of paper, and no one knew what happened.
Right. So people promised to create, they got the tax breaks, they promised to create the jobs, and didn't.
Yeah, I mean, Foxconn said it was going to create 13,000 jobs in Wisconsin, and then very quietly came back and said, oh, actually, No, it's more like 1,300 or maybe 800. And that happens all over all the time.
So I don't know whether you get into this, but what is the answer to dealing with income inequality? Is it a big tax break for the middle class? Is it higher wages for,
it's all of the above,
profit sharing or what?
Yeah, it's all of the above. It's making an economy that doesn't cater towards the biggest of the big and the richest of the rich. And it's breaking this myth that the way to build a sustainable economy is to rain money down on high on the rich guys and wait for them to be nice and create jobs for you. It's building demand from the bottom up because, again, like I talked about with the widgets and needing more customers, that's how you boost an economy and do something that's going to be sustainable in the long term. Instead of raining money down on high on an Amazon, it'd be great if Virginia said, you know what, here's how we're going to compete. We're going to have the best schools and the best infrastructure and the best quality of life because it's going to be really easy to raise a family here. And that's why a company's going to want to come to our state, not because we rain so much money on them.
Right. So the billionaire class, what is the there have been various proposals. What the highest tax rate today is what, 35%?
It's 37.
37. Yeah. Okay. The idea of raising taxes on people of, let's say, 10 million and above, right? What should that rate be?
On 10 million? High. I mean, we had 90% tax rates in this country, right?
We did at one time, right?
There are a couple of things here. One, the top bracket should obviously be much higher. Like that we top out in the 30s is silly. Ocasio-Cortez was talking about 70. But also that we top out.
And I'm not sure Elizabeth Warren has put a number on it.
I don't think she has. But there should also be multiple brackets, right? We shouldn't be treating someone who makes $400,000 the same as someone who makes $4 million, as someone who makes $40 million, right? Why not put extra brackets on the top on all of those levels? That's something Bernie Sanders has talked about quite a bit. And I really like Warren's idea of a wealth tax because part of the problem with using income taxes to get at this is a lot of rich people don't actually make traditional income. They're not sitting at a desk and getting a paycheck. Their money is tied up in investments. And so using a wealth tax to get at that money, I think, is a really, really smart play.
And how does that differ? So you're taxing...
So you're taxing their assets, essentially, and the wealth that they have in the bank and the increase in their wealth every year, not just the increase in the amount of money they're actually pulling in as income. So this is when all their investments increase in value over the year, you tax that increase in value.
Right. And their real estate, I guess,
exactly.
Right? And their yachts or
private jets.
Multiple planes and all that.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think that's really smart because one of the reasons we have seen such a vast growing income inequality is because the wealthy class has all this investment income that's taxed at a far lower. We tax capital gains far lower, which is money made from investments, from selling stocks, from being in real estate. We tax that money at a far lower rate than we do regular income. So someone like LeBron James, who's getting most of his money in a paycheck, is treated far differently and taxed far higher than someone who's just making their money through investments and having their cash just like sit around.
We should point out, I guess, there are exceptions to the greedy billionaires, right? I mean, there is a small group of, like, I can think Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, who else is in that group, who have
Nick
pledged
Hanauer,
to give away most of their money, right? And are doing so. To some pretty important causes around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we don't want to rely on the niceness of people. Like there's always that silly talking point every time someone like me says, "Hey, taxes should be higher, and you can raise them on me too if you want." Conservatives always come back like, "You can just cut a check to the Treasury. Why don't you just pay more?"
Yeah.
It's such a silly talking point. That's not the point. It needs to be systemic. We can't rely on individual decision making in this area to actually do what we need to do.
Right. Because, I mean, I totally agree with you. I salute those people who have a heart, have a conscience, whatever, and realize that they've been giving a lot of, they've earned a lot, gained a lot through their hard work, right? And now they have a responsibility they feel to give back. Right?
Yeah, but also
but
acknowledging,
you can't count on that.
No, and also acknowledging that it wasn't all hard work, right? Like I think that's a really important,
True. That's very
important point that Warren makes all the time is, yeah, you should be rewarded for your hard work, but don't forget about the schools that educated your kids and the roads that your products move on and the sense of law and order that preserves your business. You don't have to worry about someone breaking in and burning your building down because we have a government to protect you. And all of that was really important, and no one does anything
Plus,
alone.
a lot of people with this extraordinary wealth, it wasn't their hard work. It might have been their daddies or their grandfathers, right?
Yeah. I mean,
there's also that.
The fact that Republicans are always trying to cut the estate tax is one of the just most maddening things.
Totally.
I mean, you saw Ivanka Trump out there about how people don't want to be given anything. They want to work really hard for their paycheck, someone who has inherited everything.
Like she did. The book, it is red hot. The Billionaire Boondoggle. You'll love it. The Billionaire Boondoggle. Pat Garafalo is the author. It is out today, so check it out.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Mark Dudzic, Larry Hanley, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.